Ready? Pew. You gonna bring it back? I didn't think so. Hey y'all, it's Becky here from the Beckosphere, where we talk about climate news and solutions. You have entered the climate recap, where we look at what is being done to mitigate the impacts of and prepare for climate change. If you would like to stay up to date with one of the most important topics facing humanity, I highly suggest you hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you don't miss every single time I post. No pressure, of course. I realize when I say that that's probably a lot of pressure. This time, we'll be covering the news from January 17th to 31st. Let's start with the events relating to the climate changing. Rapid ice melt around volcanically active areas might increase the likelihood of eruptions, according to a new study published in the Geological Society of America. While there's plenty of room for more research on why this is the case, researchers looked back at several thousands of years into Iceland's past and found this pattern. Great! Another natural disaster made worse by climate change. Also, the recent eruption in Tonga is unlikely to make a dent in the overall warming trend. I say this because volcanic eruptions and the subsequent increase of air particles in the atmosphere usually reduce the sun's warming of Earth. Mass volcanic eruptions have caused ice ages in the past, but this one eruption will not have the power to do anywhere near as much as we would need. Speaking of the cold, the US East Coast got buried in snow for the second half of January, knocking out power in at least 9 states. New York also experienced severe thunderstorm warnings, and Florida got a random winter tornado from the strong gusts blowing over the coast. I haven't seen any formal attribution claims of climate change when regarding this storm, but the power outages are a great example of how weak our current infrastructure for energy is. On the other side of the world, Storm Anna has killed at least 88 people in East Africa, specifically Madagascar, Mozambique, and Malawi. Geez, what does Anna have against M names? Every area impacted experienced major flooding. Storms are becoming stronger and more frequent in this part of the world due to climate change warming the local waters. Cyclone Victories is expected to hit Madagascar in the next few days. Changing things up a bit, lumber prices in the US are off the rails again, currently worth about $1,200 per 1,000 board feet. The historical average is $400 per 1,000 board feet, so that's about as crazy as if a gallon of gas was worth $12. This rise in price is due to climate change, which has increased wildfires and pest activity like bark-eating beetles, specifically in Canada, where the US gets most of its lumber supply. Last year, the price of lumber went as high as $1,700 per 1,000 board feet, beating out the value of gold and Bitcoin. Climate change is making Florida's red tides worse. Red tides happen when the Carenia brevis, red phytoplankton, multiplies rapidly in response to an influx of chemicals, usually coming from runoff from stormwater, agricultural lands, or wastewater treatment plants. They can cause irritation and respiratory issues in humans and mass die-off in marine animals. Florida is still seeing the impacts of a recent event that killed off a huge number of the manatee population. Florida's recent task force determined that climate change could worsen this event with warmer water temperatures, sea level rise, changes in salinity, etc. Environmental activists were disappointed, though, that there were no recommendations to decrease fossil fuel use or to increase clean energy deployment, or even to curb chemical runoff for that matter. Quote, "The task force has ignored the elephant in the room because state regulators are not holding the polluting industries accountable through enforcement action." The last thing I want to mention for this section is just the continuous studies that have come out on how climate change causes birth complications, premature labor, and health problems for babies and kids. I'm going to leave some articles in the source section linked in the description, but I also do plan to cover the health impacts for kids in my next deep dive, where I will talk about the birth strike movement and what human population growth means for the climate crisis. So stay tuned for that. Anyways, let's get into the climate victory section, which I had a really hard time narrowing down. First, let's talk about offshore wind. The Vietnam renewable firm Trung Nam Group launched its first offshore wind farm off the southern province of Tra Vinh. Over in Scotland, Crown Estate Scotland held the first part of the country's largest offshore wind auction, raising almost $1 billion, or around 700 million pounds. The program, called ScotWind, will feature 25 turbines, which will be a mix of floating and fixed, with an installed capacity of 100 megawatts. The space auctioned can support 10 gigawatts of energy capacity and will create tens of thousands of jobs. Scotland currently has 1 gigawatt worth of offshore wind off their coast right now. Some of the auction winners for this time include Shell, BP, and the utility company Iberdrola. I'm so conflicted about fossil fuel companies buying offshore wind space because, on one hand, it's a good sign to see companies moving towards clean energy source, and offshore oil rig jobs can easily transfer to offshore wind jobs. But at the same time, I hate fossil fuel companies, and I don't want to see them in our clean energy future, mainly because I just don't trust them about as far as I can throw their execs, which is not far at all. The UK government has allocated an additional £32 million to specifically floating wind projects. Fun fact relating to UK wind energy generation in general, this one specifically having to do with onshore wind. The UK wind produced a record amount of power during Storm Malik. Notice how with fossil fuels, storms can result in spills, but with wind, it can actually produce more power. Just an observation. Back to offshore winds for a sec though, but this time in the US, I came across an article by marine geophysicist and Lamont research professor David Goldberg, who talked about the possibility of attaching direct air capture technology to offshore winds along the East Coast. He argued that the turbines can power the carbon capture technology using otherwise wasted energy, and the captured carbon can then be stored in natural marine reserves. The article, of course, will be linked in the description below, but if you're interested in me interviewing David about this idea in a future video, please let me know in the comment section below, because it does sound like a really interesting solution. Now over to Ecuador. The government has increased the sea life protection around the Galapagos Islands. Fishermen will no longer be able to fish in more than 200,000 square miles of ocean next to the archipelago. And these protections, combined with Costa Rica's recent increase in protection zones around the Cocos Islands, will create a marine highway. Overall, Ecuador, Costa Rica, Panama, and Colombia are all working to link their marine reserves together. Very, very cool. Now for some US-based climate victories. A Washington, D.C. district federal judge has shot down a recent Gulf of Mexico oil lease sale by the Biden administration, deeming all those sales unconstitutional because the decision didn't properly consider environmental impacts. It will now be up to the Department of the Interior to reassess the sale decision. Could we auction off offshore wind there instead? The same companies that would bid for those are bidding for this, so I mean. Over the last several months, fossil fuel companies and Republican public officials have challenged the EPA's power, specifically when it comes to the Clean Air Act. Hypothetically, the EPA could add greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide, methane, and nitric oxide to a list of harmful air pollutants they can regulate. But this is a big no-no for fossil fuel sympathizers. So they're putting the EPA's power to regulate air pollution as a whole into question. And this case is currently being heard by the conservative Supreme Court. It would be really bad if the EPA loses its power around this though, because it would definitely set the US back in human health things. Well, recently, top environmental groups, public health groups, clean energy groups, and several utility companies have sent a combined letter to the Supreme Court in support of the EPA's power. We will have to see if this makes a difference in the decision making. And now to the news headlines paid for by the infrastructure bill. The EPA announced it will conduct unannounced inspections of chemical plants, refineries, and other industrial sites over the next several months, specifically around disadvantaged communities like in Cancer Alley. If you don't know what I'm talking about with Cancer Alley, I covered it in a deep dive video, which I will link up above. They also plan to address horrible water conditions in areas like Jackson, Mississippi. The Biden administration also announced the Buildings Performance Standard Coalition with 33 states and cities to improve efficiency and electrification of their buildings. This group of municipalities makes up about 20% of the country's building footprint, and all parties involved agreed to up the regulations or legislation by Earth Day 2024. Some areas involved include Colorado, Washington State, New York City, LA, Chicago, Philly, and Washington, D.C. Here are a few other spending plans announced over the last 2 weeks that I'm just not going to go into detail on. The Army Corps of Engineers announced $1.1 billion for Everglades restoration. They have also been given $14 billion to tackle clean energy supply chain problems. The Interior has $4.7 billion to begin cleaning up orphaned wells. The Department of Transportation got $27 billion to fix bridges and improve climate resilience in different areas. And the Biden administration also announced $50 billion to go towards reducing wildfire risk and improve preparedness near at-risk areas. Now here are some other climate victory headlines from the last 2 weeks of January. Remember to wait to the end of the video for my favorite climate victory point. In international news, Scotland announced a new transportation blueprint to move the country towards cleaner methods of transportation. UK cities are expected to impose a levy on cars in general, and London's mayor proposed a journey charge for motorists traveling to the city. New York should implement that. Sales of electric vehicles surpassed diesel in Europe for the first time this past December. Also in the UK, British Volt got a £100 million boost to build the UK's first large-scale battery gigafactory. Over to Norway, the online grocery store Oda introduced a carbon footprint metric to their receipts, and now its customers are starting to shun red meat. And a new coral reef was discovered off the coast of Tahiti, and it's deep enough in the ocean to not be impacted yet by global warming. I forgot to also mention that Israel has okayed $720 million to plant trees in cities, and Greece is using the remainder of its COVID funds for climate mitigation and preparation. In the US, Native American groups in California and Nevada gained new control of public lands. A national monument has been proposed in Nevada to preserve a sacred site, and Save the Redwoods League donated 523 acres of forest land to the Intertribal Saconee Wilderness Council in California. LA announced that it will be moving away from oil drilling in the city. A bipartisan group of federal legislators announced a new climate adaptation bill. A House panel continues probing into big oil's history of climate disinformation. A climate lawsuit in Baltimore, Maryland is the longest lasting non-federal case alleging climate disinformation by big oil was heard by the federal judge. The results could make a landmark case. More than 450 scientists have called on different PR and creative agencies to drop their fossil fuel clients. You might remember how Edelman, the largest PR firm in the world, announced that it would look at ways to green its portfolio. Update? We have no update. Car companies ran 4 times as many EV TV commercials in the US in 2021 compared to 2020. And Lafayette Square and Invenergy launched a $500 million joint venture, Radioactivate, to help lower income houses get involved in community solar. Told you there was a lot. Now let's get to the section that I have now named It's Whatever, which has developed over the last 2 recaps. Basically, these are the news points that I consider good and bad for the environment. You'll see what I mean. Exxon announced that it will reach net zero emissions by 2050. Of course, it's just the scope 1 and 2 emissions, which negates emissions made by their product. So it's whatever. Also, Exxon recently has been under scrutiny for using the First Amendment, the freedom of speech, as a defense for its history of climate disinformation. I'm sorry, what the fuck? East Africa has received 17 million pounds from the UK to help them combat climate disasters. I think that's probably good timing considering that Storm Anna just hit and soon Cyclone Batsirai will also hit. Initially good, but the reason why I put this in the just whatever category is that it's much less than the $100 million promised by developed countries forever ago. And overall, less than half of the most climate vulnerable countries have received any money to help them. Only 13 out of 22 African countries owed money have received anything. So not necessarily a knock on the UK, but just kind of a knock on the whole thing. Australia's Prime Minister Morrison has allocated another $100 billion to the Great Barrier Reef restoration, which is great except for the fact that the administration still doesn't recognize the biggest threat to the reefs: climate change. And experts warned that they expect another mass bleaching event in the Great Barrier Reef soon. Egypt named its foreign minister to host COP27. Sameh Shoukry has zero experience in climate policy, but at least his deputy will be well experienced. Climate scientist Yasmin Fawad was the lead author of the 2017 IPCC report's chapter on desertification, and she co-chaired financial talks for COP26. So it's whatever because the guy in charge doesn't have any experience, but his deputy has a lot of experience. So President Biden officially announced defeat over the Build Back Better Act, and his administration is now planning to put different pieces of the $1.75 trillion plan into different chunks to be sent through the system. And the global financial firms can't seem to make up their mind over divestment. On one hand, Aviva Investors announced that it will vote to kick out firm directors that don't support sustainability goals, similar to what BlackRock said that they will do. The UK's largest private pension fund, USS, shifted £5 billion away from polluters, reducing emissions associated with its holdings by 30%. Citigroup in the US announced its plans to move to net zero emissions by 2050. That's all great, right? Well, at the same time, BlackRock, which kind of popularized the whole divestment trend, and Citigroup have now stated that divesting funds from fossil fuels is not a good move. They argue that it will make the clean energy transition rockier and basically revoked their capitalist influence. Capitalism is the power to shape society and act as a powerful catalyst for change. But businesses can't do this alone, and they cannot be the climate police. Okay, so the US private sector revokes its responsibility, and the Federal Reserve Chair, Jerome Powell, has said that he doesn't think that the Reserve has much power to regulate where funds go. Quote, "Our role on climate change is a limited one, but it's an important one. It's to ensure that the banking institutions that we regulate understand their risks and can manage them." So who's in charge of getting taxpayer money out of fossil fuels? You see why all those were kind of meh points? Okay, so now let's get on to the full-on climate fails. Starting off strong with our two favorite C words, China and coal. China broke its record for coal output for the month of December and for a year for 2021. I know that's mainly due to the energy crisis, but that is just really not the right direction. Unsurprisingly, the global seaborne coal trade rose 5.7% in 2021, and also unsurprisingly, a giant methane plume has emerged over the Jiangxi province, the largest coal province in China. On to oil. Mexican's president has decided to buy a Texas oil refinery to gain energy independence. Obrador wants to end Mexican oil exports in the next 2 years, but instead of investing in clean energy, he's going to pay $596 million to rehabilitate the country's oil industry. Mexico's previous president pledged in 2004 to have clean energy represent a third of the country's energy generation by 2024. But Obrador has allegedly undone a lot of these efforts. In the UK, a judge has determined that the UK oil regulator is not legally required to consider tax breaks to oil and gas companies or emissions from burning fossil fuels, aka Scope 3 emissions, when regulating the North Sea sector. So basically, there's nothing to see over there. Okay, so do you all remember during COP26 how many countries, including where most of the rainforests were, signed a reforestation pledge? And then Indonesia backing out of it at the last minute? Well, if you don't know what I'm talking about, I did a video on COP26. Indonesia has the third largest spread of rainforests in the world and is, like Brazil, cutting it down to make room for palm oil. Okay, well, it turns out that Indonesia might have gotten cold feet in the conference because Norway underpaid reforestation efforts in 2010. So it wasn't priced comparable to palm oil sales. Apparently, if Norway paid Indonesia based on the carbon taken up by the trees that they saved, they should have paid a lot more money than they did. But I guess maybe on the bright side, if we can convince them to get back into the agreement because we will pay the proper price, then that might be good, maybe. Now, we can't finish off this section without heading back home. In the US, the Forest Service has proposed a new plan that would quadruple the logging along the Appalachian Trail. In addition to being the nation's most popular forest, it also contains a lot of old-growth trees, which take up way more carbon than reforested areas. This goes against Biden's plans to conserve 30% of federal land and waters by 2030 and his pledge to reduce deforestation. So, no bueno. Here are the other articles I found interesting from the last 2 weeks of January. Both of them are US based. Arizona Cooperation Commission narrowly voted down a bill that would push the state towards 100% clean energy. Alaska ruled against youths on a climate change lawsuit. Time for the fossil fuel fails. Besides, contributing to climate change. Gotta remember that they suck locally too. Peru declared a state of emergency after 21 beaches were polluted with oil linked to the Tonga eruption. The oil came from a damaged Spain-based Repsol refinery. Over to diesel, a pipeline owned by Collins Pipeline Co. leaked 300,000 gallons of diesel next to New Orleans, Louisiana. The operators delayed needed repairs. What is it with fossil fuel and utility companies delaying needed repairs? The spill was actually discovered December 27th, but it wasn't made publicly known until recently. Now on to gas. A small study of cooktops, ovens, and boilers in 53 California homes found that stoves leak an estimated 0.8 to 1.3% of the gas they consume as unburned methane. There's 40 million stoves in the US homes last counted, which was 2015, so that definitely adds up. Living near fracking sites can result in premature death among elderly people living downstream or nearby, according to the first major study on this subject. At least 17.6 million people live near a well in the US. People who live near or downstream from plants experience worse air and water quality, as well as noise and light pollution. And people were more likely to die prematurely the closer they lived to a plant, regardless of racial, socioeconomic, and other environmental variables. So it's definitely the plant that's doing that. That being said, fossil fuel plants have historically been put next to communities of color, so this issue can easily be classified as an environmental justice one. And now to carbon capture technology. A Global Witness report stated that Shell's massive carbon capture plant is emitting more than it's capturing. Located in Alberta, Canada, the company's first green plant is emitting the equivalent of 1.2 million gas-powered cars, more specifically from its process of refining tar sands into hydrogen. It's also emitting methane. Shell didn't respond to these findings. In other fossil fuel fails, scientists have declared that we've officially passed the planet's chemical boundary with all the plastics, antibiotics, agricultural chemicals, industrial compounds, and of course, fossil fuels that we have put into our environment. We have already altered the Earth out of a balance that it's been in for 10,000 years. Humans are very talented, but this doesn't mean that it can't get better or worse, so we should pick the better side. Okay, it's time for my favorite climate victory point of the week. The community solar company Pearl X and the solar power product vendor Solar Edge started a new program called Project Tech Flex to solve that pesky multifamily problem. The problem is that it's hard for landlords and tenants to tap into economic benefits of adding solar when it has to do with like apartment buildings and stuff. So the companies are planning to give a small apartment in Houston solar panels and battery storage, making themselves the energy supplier and the landlords the utility holders for the tenants to pay. The tenant gets lower utility costs and a backup system for grid outages, the landlord gets paid, and Pearl X gets money from selling excess energy back to the grid. This project also encourages microgrids, which are more secure and resilient than larger grids. SolarEdge embedded software in its inverters and batteries that can respond to signals from utilities or energy markets. So it's more of a self-healing system, kind of like the game theory grid method that I talked about in the last climate recap. So that was my favorite climate victory point. I think it's a really cool idea. And that was the climate recap from January 17th to 31st. Please let me know in the comments below which you found the most interesting. And if you are interested in this kind of content, remember to please like and subscribe. Sorry this video is a little late, but it's actually my birthday weekend. I am officially old enough to rent a car with lower insurance. That's the coolest thing you get for being 25, I think. Until next time, remember to talk about the climate crisis every single day and to support your local news organizations. A big thank you to the people on Patreon who helped me pay for my equipment and the many new subscriptions needed to make these recaps possible. A special shout out to my climate confident and courageous David H, FK, Norman Anal, Greg H, and Paul B. I greatly appreciate your support. If you would like to join the Beckosphere Patreon, please check out the link in the description box below. Or if you would like to make a one-time donation, check out the Buy Me a Coffee link below. Bye for now.